Hello, fellow investors. Welcome to NordicFinans. Today, we have quite a special episode for you guys. We are talking about how to invest or investment principles based on biology. With me, I have, of course,
Marcus. And before we begin, please remember to invest in the like button and the positive subscribe to our channel.
Yeah, please do. And I almost forgot I'm Lucas, in case you didn't know. And with us, we have a friend of ours, a mutual friend, Jesper. Care to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Lucas. I'd be happy to be here, guys. So yes, my name is Jesper and I am your friend. And I'm also a major in biology and interested in science and investing. And even though I'm an amateur investor myself, I have had an interest in the stock market since I was 14. Well, I bought my first shares for good profit, by the way, when I was 14. But I've been interested in the stock market even before that. I followed stock trading for several years before I made my first purchase, which was part of my strategy. But forget about my backstory. Today I want to talk about investment strategies and how we can analyze markets as amateurs using common sense principles. Because investment is hard. You can't be stupid if you want to invest, but it's not rocket science. It's biology. There are a lot of similarities between the stock market and nature because our very economy is actually based upon nature. If you think about it, we traded furs already for many thousand years ago, and everything that came after that is really just a continuation of this. Industries, just as life, is ultimately dependent on natural resources and so on and so on. So bear with me here while I do some quick comparisons between the stock market and the biosphere. So all life in the world follows some basic principles. You have organic growth and you have competition between species. We know that predators consume smaller prey, and we know that many animals seek out new hunting grounds when they run low on resources. There is also symbiosis and commensalisms, and most importantly, everything is organized into ecosystems and niches. And this is also true for the stock market. You have the global stock market, and inside the global stock market you have local industry markets, and inside these you have other small ecosystems where businesses compete and cooperate with each other. And you also have many different niches and niching opportunities that you can invest in. Are you following me so far, guys? Do you see the similarities?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess you could talk about the world on a global scale, or the economy on a global scale, and then on a national level, and then maybe on an industry level, for example, within a nation, or even on a local level within a nation.
Exactly. And just as nature, you have a limited amount of resources, but when you start using these resources, you get more niches, which in turn enables further niching and so on. So life enables life and business enables business. The economy is growing and so is also biodiversity growing naturally unless you interfere with it. Of course, there are physical constraints, just as there are market constraints, which ultimately limits growth in local markets and in nature in local ecosystems. But they are actually quite similar, and it's important to realize that the laws of nature are fundamental. They are just as true inside economy as they are inside biology. And the point here is today that it can be quite overwhelming for new investors such as ourselves to get a grasp of this because the technical barriers can be quite daunting. Personally, I think that the reason that many people don't invest in something simple as, for example, index funds is not that they don't know what is a good investment. It's rather that they are overwhelmed with all the technical stuff and um, understanding the different value indicators and the market trends and so on. But I prefer long-term investment strategies, and I don't look at numbers and so on. I try to understand things by using common sense, and I think that examples from nature is as common sense as it gets. Everyone understands that bears eat smaller prey, and that's much easier to explain that the fact that big businesses buy up and invest in smaller businesses and outmaneuver them in different technical ways and so on. But I think that everything will get clearer when we dive into the three principles that I want to talk about today. So if you guys don't have any questions right now, we can dive into it. Or do you want me to try to clarify this a bit more?
I actually think you have done a really good job, and I'm really following you so far.
Yeah, I think it's good. I think you can dive right in.
Excellent. So bear with me. It can seem a bit complicated at first, but at the end of this, you should have tools to understand and analyze markets yourselves without any real technical knowledge. So, principle number 1, minimum limiting factor. Lucas, please explain what minimum limiting factor means in biology. Go.
So, minimum limiting factor, you can think of it sort of as a bottleneck. So, at an airport, where are all the lines? It's the security, because at security you can only take a few people at a time. Similarly, in nature, when you have a limited amount of resources, that's going to determine how much of a certain organism can grow in that area, because if they don't have enough water, for example, not everyone are going to be able to grow there.
Exactly. It's if you think about human existence, it doesn't matter how much food and water we have. If there for some reason is an air pollution and we run low on oxygen, the price of oxygen masks will increase drastically, because we can't survive unless we have all necessary resources to thrive. And if one of these resources is limited, this will be the most valuable resource. This insight is something you can exploit when you invest in stocks, because you can invest in resources rather than in end products. So, for example, if we take Tesla as an example, Tesla is a quite highly valued company, but the future for electric cars is a bit uncertain, and Tesla has a history of being a little bit unstable. But if you want, you can instead invest in lithium, which is a minimum limiting factor for making the car batteries. And lithium is an example that's quite interesting, actually, because many experts believe that the price of lithium will increase quite a lot in the future. It's needed for many kinds of power cells and also solar technology. Marcus, maybe you have some insight into lithium, actually.
I do know of it, yes, but I would also like, in a sense, to compare what you just said also to oil, which is another one I would say is considered a minimum limiting factor, because the picture you painted with Tesla is pretty good, but I could also picture like a supermarket, for instance. You have a retail trade and you have all these different products there that you could buy, and you could, for instance, buy shares of the companies producing each of these. Why not instead just buy a company that produces oil, which all of the companies in the retail trade are going to need to transport their goods to the store? So in that case, you are buying almost a share of everyone, because it was common knowledge that like the price of all consumer things are in part based upon the price of oil, because oil, it takes whatever it is, it takes oils to bring it to where it was, at least before this whole internet, like before internet became a massive aspect. But oil still remains one of the most important thing in consumer index pricing.
Yes.
So I think this is comparable to what you just said.
Oil is another good example. And another example is also cobalt, which is important for cutting edge technology such as mobile phones to some extent, and so on. And the price of cobalt is about, I think, like almost $40 per kilogram, whereas lithium still is just $9 per kilogram. But both oil and cobalt are resources that are somewhat being replaced because of ethical issues and because of practical issues. And this is something also to keep in mind. If you can find what will be the next limiting resource in growing industries, then it can be a clever way to minimize risk and diversify your holdings by investing in these. But of course, you want to be careful, you want to understand what you're doing. But identifying minimum limiting factors at least will give you a better understanding of how the whole food chain operates. Okay, so if there are no further questions, I think we can go to principle number 2 now.
Just to clarify though, so the way you can see the minimum limiting factor is, I see it almost as a resource.
It's you are investing in a resource, but what you really want to do is to invest in the most important resource that enables everything else. Because if you have resource in abundance, the price will be pretty low. It's only when a resource gets rare, then it's very highly valued. The price reflects, the rarity reflects the price and vice versa.
Yeah, okay. I think that's very well explained.
And I actually recommend you guys to invest in lithium right now, because that's something that will become more and more sought after when the solar industry keeps growing and the electric car industry keeps growing and so on, because lithium is needed all the time in these sectors.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think this is a good example as well, because both of us have been, Marcus, you've already invested in the solar industry, right? So this would be a good example of then instead investing in what provides. But I guess this also leads us quite smoothly into the next principle, which is key providers.
Yes, okay. Principle number 2, key providers. So, first, biology. In biology, a key organism is an organism that enables many other organisms to thrive, and I'm talking about species level here. So you have one species that many others depend upon. And it's not just about the food chain. It's not about just cows eating grass. It's about a magical grass that enables the thriving of many different kinds of organisms. And this is the same in business. You want to identify key players that enables trans-industry operations. So one example here that could be worth investing in the future is SaaS software. You know what SaaS software is? PayPal, for example.
Yeah, software as a service. But I'm thinking, could I even ask you a question at this stage? Would Amazon in the past, could Amazon have been a contender for one of these key providers? Because it's now definitely a trans-industrial company that is doing very well in any industry it involves itself in.
I wouldn't actually count Amazon, but Google and Microsoft would be much better examples when the markets were still growing in those sectors. Now all these three companies now have somewhat of a monopoly, but Google and Microsoft enables many other companies to try, whereas Amazon is actually not super beneficial to many other businesses, as far as I know.
Drives them out, in a sense.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, now
exactly.
I really see what you're going with.
So another a counter example would be train chairs. Only trains use train chairs. Trains buy train chairs from certain providers, but there are only train companies who invest in train chairs. So it's quite useless. The same goes with yarn. Everyone needs yarn to make clothing, but anyone can make yarn out of cotton, so it's not so special. You want to identify key providers. That means really valuable, important actors that are somewhat unique. So some other example would be power cells and certain engine parts. Another example would be motherboards. So microtransistors and processors, that would be maybe more of a basic resource, whereas motherboards are used in all kinds of electrical devices. So companies who specializes in making motherboards could be considered a key provider in the electrical engineering sector. And I wanted to talk about the biotech sector and the pharmaceutical sector here as well, because these industries, the pharmaceutical industry, the global pharmaceutical industry, is a really tricky place to make investments. You can buy pharmaceutical stocks when the company is investigating some promising drug, for example, but it doesn't mean that the stock price will keep increasing, because the drug can also fail spectacularly. Only 10% of drugs that enter phase 1 trials actually reach the marketing stage. So the very, very vast majority of drugs are discarded. This is something I have extremely detailed insight into from my own studies and from taking courses with pharmacists and so on. It's something actually my university specializes in. And biotech is similar because new inventions in the biotech field can be extremely promising, but they can also fail spectacularly because of the nature of the science and engineering in these fields. It's very volatile to invest in these sectors. But one way to remedy this is to invest in contract research organizations. When it comes to pharma, you can invest in companies that serve the pharmaceutical industry by providing trials and testing for them, and also market analysis and so on. So, for example, when you have a cancer drug, you need to test it on up to tens of thousands of people before the FDA will approve it, or some other national board of supervision. But by hiring contract research organizations to handle the testings and all the different phases of trials, you can actually minimize risk by investing in these companies. When you invest in a CRO, the CRO will profit from cooperating with the big pharma, no matter the results of the trials. So the pharmaceutical company will pay the CRO to do the testing. If the drug turns out to be a disaster, they will still have paid the CRO. If the drug succeeds, they will continue the testings, and the company will gain even more profit from them. Was this clear? Do you follow me?
Yes, I do, but I do want to ask if these CROs could be considered service providers in that sense, because they sound very similar to very secure service providers.
They are, and they are very secure investments, but very few people know about these kinds of companies.
That's true. I have never heard about them before.
And this is the point of key providers. They are usually invisible. It's the same in the car engine industry. Like, everyone knows the big car brands, but how many know which companies provide engine parts? I mean, to a large degree now, the big players have bought up every step of the process, but especially in the early days.
That's not actually true. Tesla is very famous because they're almost the only one that actually do this. That's their big thing.
Oh, okay, really?
Yeah, the other ones are very reliant usually upon like suppliers and stuff like that, sub-suppliers. There's a massive supply chains behind these cars, and Tesla is the only one that controls. I think you even mentioned earlier that they might even control part of lithium production now, which is unheard of a lot of other companies. They have a completely different business model.
We talked about it before the recording here. It's true.
So
So the example stands. You want to identify key providers that not everyone knows of, suppliers that are really important for the big players.
Yeah.
When it comes to CROs, I will give you some quick examples. One is IQVIA. This is a company that's industry leading. A lot of pharmaceutical companies use it, and a lot of other health service companies use it for testing and trials and other kinds of services. Other examples are Parexel and Icon and MedPace. But I really encourage the listener here to do his or her own research into CROs, contract research organizations. This is for pharma. Briefly here, another example is Biotech Etfs. So if you want to invest in the biotech field, you can invest in exchange trading funds that specializes in biotech. And you have talked previously about what an ITF is.
Well, we briefly defined it as similar to an index fund, but it usually tracks a specific, for example, industry, even more specific than index funds usually are. And most importantly is that it can be traded in a similar way as a normal stock, meaning instantaneously. Because whenever I buy or sell an index fund, I have to wait a couple of days for the transaction to actually go through.
Yeah, I would basically call it a fund, not necessarily an index fund, but a fund that you can trade as a stock.
Yeah, that's very similar.
And the thing here is that you can diversify your holdings by investing in these biotech ETFs. So, if there is a breakthrough in any of the companies that the fund holds, the value will go up and you will make a profit. But even if many companies fail, which they do frequently, the ETF will usually balance itself anyway. And there are different kinds of biotech ETFs. They regulate themselves in different ways. I will give you 3 examples you can look up yourself. The first one I really recommend for long-term investment is Genomics. And it's an ETF that very few people know about. It specializes in gene editing and stem cell therapy. And this is something that will be huge in the future. The thing is, we don't know when it will actually have the breakthrough, but it just means it's cheaper to buy it now. It's a long-term investment, potentially. Then you have the Spider S&P Biotech. The code for this one is XBI. Look it up. It's quite cheap. It's under $200, and it's a quite famous one. It's been promoted by Motley Fool several times, actually. And finally, there is the biggest, most popular one, the Nasdaq Biotech Etf, and its code is IBB. And this is the big player that most people invest in. I think it's like 90% biotech and 10% pharma. These ways, you will invest in crucial middlemen. So it's like basically investing in spades and shovels, just that the spades and shovels are very, very rare and not many people know about them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good real life current example. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the spades and shovels saying, what was
Yeah, the spades and shovels analogy Lucas told here earlier. He told me before the recording here that it comes from the gold rush era, when it was a better investment to sell picks and shovels and spades than to actually invest in gold itself.
Instead of trying to find the gold yourself.
Yes, instead of trying to find the gold and mine it yourself, you just sell the tools for others to do the job for you. Or, they might succeed, they might fail, but they will still buy the picks and shovels.
Yeah, so that's the idea.
Anyway, I think we got a lot of things to consider here, but key providers, invest in key providers and identify them. When you identify the key providers in a market, you will gain a better understanding of the market as a whole. Look up the car industry, for example, if you want to practice, I guess.
Or I guess like a key provider, and that has really been rewarded for being a key provider, is Nvidia. The producer of GPUs in computers, because there's no company that produces GPUs of even a similar quality to Nvidia right now, and you can really see it in their stock price because they have an extremely high valuation.
Yeah, don't buy it right now, guys.
No, but if you could have bought Nvidia before it was very apparent that it is a key provider, then you could have seen a massive opportunity at that time, I think.
Actually, I would argue that Nvidia would be classified more as an actor that controls a basic resource, because I would consider microprocessors to be a basic resource in that industry. But it's still a key actor for sure, and that's the major point, I guess, here. But Nvidia actually has competitors, and it had competitors when it was more when it was valued more sensible. Yeah, exactly. So
and this might change in the future if the competitors catches up, definitely. I guess IBM would have been another one, that they were the first ones producing computers on a large scale. Maybe those would be a better example.
Yeah, and SaaS software overall, I would say, like PayPal and Stripe and so on, that enables e-commerce. But let's move on, guys. Let's move on to principle number 3, okay? Let's talk about equilibrium in key markets. So this is a very interesting principle because it's backed by natural science on so many levels, but it's also heavily represented in basic financing. Markus, you told me that this is something called the Boston...
Yeah, the growth matrix by the Boston Consulting Group, or the growth matrix in general. But if you want to, you can for sure present your findings first.
Exactly. So my perspective is that of a biologist. If we put this principle in really simple terms, I would say that a completely new market is volatile and unstable, and an oversaturated market carries little room for growth and has small profit margins, also it might risk stagnation and decay. So what you really want to do is invest in stable growing markets. It's fine if they are semi-saturated and growing at a stable rate, but you should avoid stagnation. Likewise, you should avoid really new markets. AI is an interesting example because AI is rapidly growing, but it's hard to say if it's already an established market or if the AI technology is still too new and the markets are still a bit volatile. The AI companies are a bit volatile and it's hard to figure out the niching in this sector.
But it's also important to remember that what you're talking about now is markets, right? Not individual stocks.
Yes,
I think
exactly.
You can apply this same theory actually to individual companies and stocks if you want to, but of course we're talking about markets here.
Yes, we are talking about markets here because ultimately when you are a new investor, you want first to you could consider individual companies, but it's important to analyze the market. And here we have talked about resources, we have talked about middlemen, and now we talk about the market as a whole. And the market can always be growing or shrinking or stagnating, you know. You have new markets, you have old markets, and you have everything in between. And you usually want to stay somewhere in the middle. The perfect safe and healthy industry is somewhere in the middle because life enables life, and the more in biology you know that the more biodiversity you have, the more niches will appear. But on the other hand, there are always limited resources and limited room. You have market constraints in the stock market, and you can't keep on growing forever unless you transcend into new industries or new regions. And this put constraints on everything. So you want to find markets that are growing but at a stable rate. That's my 5 cents on this.
Yeah, the way they presented it to us in my university, it was basically that you want to try to find companies that would be represented by people in their middle to young age, for instance, that they have a lot of years left to grow and they are not fully old and just providing you with like pension money, so to speak, or and that they might be stagnating or even dying soon. And neither do you want to invest in too young companies or industries that are not really proven themselves, and they might have a high chance of actually just toppling over yet because they don't really have a history or a proven track record that you can be sure that this is for sure an industry that is going to grow into the later years.
We can talk about we have talked about oil previously. Like the energy sector as a whole it's experiencing major changes right now. We go from coal and oil and gas to more environmentally friendly solutions. We go into water and wind power and solar energy and so on. And if I would give you something that you could consider investing in, it would be virtual engines and cloud computing, because this is a rapidly growing industry, but it's already quite stable and it already has a quite big diversity, I would say. It could pay off to be a little bit careful and still wait for it to really take off, but virtual engines and cloud-based services is something that I personally would say is more safe to invest in than the whole AI field. And I know quite a lot about AI technology actually. I don't have any professional knowledge, but I have studied it quite extensively, and I would put my money on virtual solutions instead, virtual engines and so on. Do you know what virtual engines and all of that is about? Do you know what it's all about?
No, I was just about to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. So the thing is that it's quite expensive to develop new technology, and most of all it's quite expensive to test engines on a large scale and so on. So every time that, for example, Wärtsilä in Finland wants to sell an engine, So they need to test it and really make sure that the engine works perfectly before they sell it. And this is quite resource demanding. But if you instead can simulate it in a computer, it's much cheaper. And also the very development of new technology in virtual reality and in software, it's easier. It's easier for an engineer to test something in virtual reality than to test it in real life. And this is actually a trans industry. So there are a lot of different fields where it pays off to run simulations on a cloud service instead of using your own personal resources to test everything. Yeah, do you think that you got the picture here?
Yeah, I think it's been a really informative and interesting perspective. And like as you talked with me before when we had this idea to do this collaboration, that it's all about getting additional tools to work with and like a new frame of mind.
Yes.
New frame how to envision like your investment process.
Yes, that's really my take-home message. Okay, guys, I think that we have covered a lot of ground now. It's time to wrap things up. So today we have talked about 3 principles to analyze industries and to find good candidates to invest in. The first one was limiting minimum factor, and the idea here is to invest in limited resources that are very important. And the second factor was key providers. You want to invest in middlemen. You want to invest in providers in order to diversify your holdings and minimize risk, rather than to invest in the big players and their end products and end services. So for example, we talked about PayPal here, and we talked about power cells and so on. And then we talked about CROs for pharma industry, and we talked about Biotech Etfs for the biotech industry. And these are things that few people think about, so it could be a good idea to look at these. And finally, we talked about markets, and that markets are growing and eventually stagnating, and that you want to invest in markets that are still growing at a stable rate. Life enables life and business enables business. So, in the middle, that's where things happen. That's where the businesses have most freedom. In saturated markets and monopoly markets, it's hard to make good profit. So look for growing markets. And yeah, that was it. The take home message here would be to not overcomplicate finance and not just look blindly at trend lines and numbers and value indicators, but rather try to understand the market as a whole and where your company fits into it. So, guys, good luck with your investment, and that's all for me. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just like to tell you here real quickly, because we've talked about fundamental investing before on this channel, and I think this is a really nice alternative perspective, but that is very similar to fundamental investing, that you try to understand the market, the business on a level which transcends like just the numbers, how well it's done the last year, but you really understand what can this business do, what is it doing right now, and where could it go, where could it be 5-10 years from now. And I think what Jesper has taught us here today is really something that could be a great tool to help you do that. But with that, I think that was a really good summary of today's episode. So thank you so much, Jesper, for being here with us. I found this episode really interesting myself. I feel like I've learned a lot.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, our pleasure. It was really nice. Hopefully you can come sometime in the future as well, maybe.
Maybe.
Maybe. We'll see. We can always hope. But with that, all that's left to do is wish all of you other happy investing.
Happy investing, guys.
Bye.